Scary telling.
I never thought I would step foot in that RV park again, but here I am, standing in front of the same site where it all happened. It's been 15 years, but the memories of that day are still vivid in my mind. My family had decided to go on a camping trip in the middle of nowhere. We were a big group, my parents, my siblings, my aunt and uncle, and their kids. The RV park was old and isolated, with a small lake nearby for fishing. We were excited to spend a week there, away from the noise and chaos of the city. On the first day, we were all gathered outside our RV, watching my cousin try out his fishing rod. I was sitting on the steps, enjoying the fresh air, when I saw my younger cousin come running out of another RV, straight into the path of the hook. I still remember the sound of the hook piercing through his forehead and the blood gushing out. The scene was chaotic, with everyone screaming and running around. My younger cousin was rushed to the hospital, and luckily he survived, but the scar remained. After that day, things started to get weird. We all felt like something was off about the RV park. Strange noises would come from the woods at night, and we would wake up to find things moved around in our RV. My aunt and uncle swore they saw shadows moving around outside their window, but when they went to investigate, there was no one there. As the days passed, things got worse. We would hear footsteps outside our RV at night, and the sound of someone breathing heavily. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just our imagination, but it became too much to bear. One night, my younger cousin woke up screaming, saying he saw someone standing outside his window. The next day, we decided to leave the RV park and cut our trip short. We never spoke about what happened again and never went back to that cursed place. But something has been gnawing at me since then, something I can't explain. I decided to come back here and confront my fears. As I stand in front of the RV site, I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The place is empty and quiet, but I know that something is watching me. I walk towards the lake, and that's when I see it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me with dark, empty eyes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were thin and bony. I froze in terror, unable to move or scream. Then I heard a voice, a whisper in my ear. "You should have never come back here." And just like that, the figure vanished into thin air. I ran back to my car, not looking back, and drove away from that cursed place as fast as I could. I don't know what I saw or what happened, but I know that I will never come back to that RV park again. The curse lives on, and I hope that no one else ever has to experience the terror we went through all those years ago. I never thought that a simple camping trip with my family and my sister's future in-laws would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be a chance to bond with each other and enjoy the beautiful scenery of Montana. But something dark and sinister was lurking in the woods, waiting for us. One day, we decided to go backpacking in Glacier National Park. The hike was grueling, and I was on my period, which made it even more challenging. I had to carry a heavy pack and walk for hours in the scorching sun. I was tired, hungry, and in pain, but I tried to push through it and enjoy the experience. But then came the worst part. I had to deal with my used tampons. We were in a national park, which meant we had to take all of our trash with us, including my feminine hygiene products. My sister's fiancé had a special bag for them, but the idea of giving him my used tampons was too awkward and embarrassing for me to handle. I tried to hide them as best I could, but eventually I had to give them to him. After that, things started to get strange. We would hear strange noises at night, like someone or something was following us. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just our imagination, but it was too persistent to ignore. One night, while we were sitting around the campfire, we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the woods. It was a woman's voice, full of pain and terror. We all jumped up, thinking someone was hurt, but when we searched the area, there was no one there. The next day, we decided to cut our backpacking trip short and head back to the RV. But as we were packing up, we found something that would change our lives forever. It was the tampon bag. But it wasn't just a bag of used tampons. It was something else entirely. There were strange symbols drawn on the bag, and it was covered in a thick layer of dirt and grime. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. Inside the bag, we found a lock of hair, a tooth, and a scrap of cloth that looked like it had been torn from someone's clothing. It was like a macabre trophy, a sign that something evil was stalking us. We decided to leave the park and head back home as soon as possible, but the nightmare was far from over. We started to experience strange occurrences in our everyday lives, like objects moving on their own or strange whispers in our ears. It was like something had followed us back from the park, something that was not of this world. Years passed, but the memories of that camping trip never faded. I still have nightmares about the tampon bag and the things we found inside it. I still wonder what happened to the woman who screamed in the woods that night, and if she was a victim of the same evil force that haunted us. I learned a valuable lesson that summer. Sometimes, the scariest things in life are the ones that we can't see, the ones that lurk in the shadows, waiting to strike. The tampon bag was just the beginning of a horror that would follow us for the rest of our lives. I thought the worst part of camping would be the lack of a proper shower, but I was wrong. Dead wrong. The wolf spider that invaded my stall made me fear for my life. After the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Everywhere I went, I felt like 8 eyes were watching me. I told my husband, but he just laughed it off and told me I was being paranoid. One night, while we were sitting around the campfire, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside our tent. I nudged my husband, but he was sound asleep. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, but then I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps. I was paralyzed with fear, too scared to even scream. Suddenly, the zipper to our tent began to slowly unzip. My heart was pounding in my chest and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. Just as I thought I was about to meet my demise, my husband jolted awake and turned on his flashlight. Standing outside our tent was the biggest wolf spider I had ever seen. It was staring right at me with its 8 beady eyes. My husband quickly grabbed a nearby stick and tried to shoo it away, but the spider didn't budge. It just kept staring at me. Finally, my husband managed to get it to scurry off into the darkness. But the fear didn't end there. Every night, I felt like the spider was still watching me, waiting for its chance to strike. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling was too strong. One day, while we were hiking in the woods, we came across a dilapidated cabin. It was covered in cobwebs and looked like it hadn't been inhabited in years. As we got closer, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, I saw the same wolf spider from the shower stall crawling towards me. I froze, too scared to even move. The spider crawled up my leg and I could feel its hairy legs brushing against my skin. My husband tried to brush it off, but it just crawled back up. That's when we heard a voice coming from the cabin. It was a woman's voice, and it was singing a haunting melody. My husband and I looked at each other in confusion. We didn't think anyone else was in the area. The spider suddenly scurried off and disappeared into the woods. We cautiously approached the cabin and peered inside. It was dark, but we could see the outline of a woman sitting in a rocking chair. She turned to look at us with a blank expression on her face. "Leave now," she said in a monotone voice. "This is not a place for the living." We didn't need to be told twice. We hightailed it out of there as fast as we could. But the feeling of being watched never went away. And every night, I swear I could hear that haunting melody playing in my head. The wolf spider may have been the least of my worries after all. I was excited for our family camping trip. We packed up the truck and drove 12 hours to our destination. It was a beautiful spot by the lake with breathtaking views. We had everything we needed, or so we thought. On the second day of our trip, my stepdad took the keys to the truck to get something from the car. We were all sitting by the lake enjoying the sunshine when we heard a loud splash. It was the keys. My stepdad had accidentally dropped them into the lake. We were stranded. There was no other vehicle for miles, and our cell phones had no signal. We didn't know what to do. Panic set in as we realized we were completely alone and stranded in the middle of nowhere. As the day wore on, we started to get worried. We had no food or water, and the temperature was dropping fast. We built a fire and tried to keep warm, but it wasn't enough. We huddled together in our tent and tried to sleep, but it was hard with the howling wind and the sounds of the forest all around us. The next morning, we decided to go on foot to look for help. We had no idea where we were or how far it was to the nearest town, but we had no other choice. We walked for hours through the forest, trying to stay on track and avoid getting lost. As the sun started to set, we stumbled upon a small cabin. We were relieved to find some shelter, but we were also cautious. Who lived here? Were they friendly? We decided to take our chances and knock on the door. An old man opened the door and looked at us suspiciously. We explained our situation and begged him for help. He reluctantly let us in and gave us some food and water. He told us that he lived alone and didn't get many visitors. He warned us to be careful and stay inside at night, as there were dangerous animals in the woods. We were grateful for his help, but we were also scared. We didn't know what to expect in this strange place. As night fell, we heard strange noises outside. We could hear footsteps and growling. We were too scared to look outside and decided to lock the door and stay inside. That's when we heard a knock on the door. It was a loud, persistent knock that wouldn't stop. We were too scared to answer it. The knocking continued for what felt like hours. We huddled together in fear, praying that whoever or whatever was outside would go away. The next morning, we woke up to find that the knocking had stopped. We decided to leave the cabin and try to find our way back to our campsite. We thanked the old man for his help and started to make our way back. As we walked through the forest, we realized that something was following us. We could hear footsteps behind us, but every time we turned around, there was nothing there. We started to run, but the footsteps only got louder. We were being chased by something, but we didn't know what. We finally made it back to our campsite, exhausted and terrified. We packed up our things and left immediately. We never spoke of that trip again, but we all knew that we had experienced something truly terrifying in the woods. From that day on, I never went camping again. The memories of that trip still haunt me to this day. The thought of being stranded and alone in the woods with no one to help us still gives me chills. I had been excited for weeks about our camping trip. My boyfriend and I had planned everything, from the food we would eat to the hikes we would take. But one thing we couldn't plan for was the man in the campsite next to us. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face and a scruffy beard. He kept to himself at first, but my boyfriend struck up a conversation with him one evening and invited him over for dinner and some drinks. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I went along with it. We made small talk over grilled chicken and corn on the cob, but things took a turn when the man started to get very drunk. He started talking about how he was there to meet a swingers group and how he hoped to find someone to spend the night with. I was disgusted and uncomfortable, but my boyfriend seemed unfazed. Then the man turned his attention to me. He leaned in close and said, "You're a beautiful young woman. Your boyfriend is a lucky man. But what do you say we have a little fun tonight?" I was horrified. I tried to make excuses, saying that I wasn't feeling well and wanted to go to bed early. But the man persisted, trying to convince my boyfriend to let him sleep with me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my boyfriend that I was going to sleep in the back seat of the truck. He didn't argue with me, but I could tell he was disappointed. I crawled into the back seat, feeling scared and alone. I had brought a machete with us on the trip, just in case we needed it for protection. I clutched it tightly as I tried to fall asleep. But then I heard footsteps outside the truck. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped at the back of the truck, and I heard a faint tapping on the window. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel someone's presence outside. I gripped the machete tighter, ready to defend myself if necessary. But then the tapping stopped, and the footsteps retreated. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening for any sign of danger. The next morning, I told my boyfriend what had happened. He was apologetic and promised to keep a closer eye on the man in the campsite next to us. But the rest of the trip was tainted by the fear that had taken hold of me that night. I couldn't relax, couldn't enjoy the beautiful scenery or the fresh air. And when we finally packed up to leave, I breathed a sigh of relief. But I knew that I would never forget the unwanted camper and the fear he had instilled in me. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. I was sleeping with my cousins outside of a cabin that our parents were staying in. It was a clear, starry night, and the air was crisp and refreshing. But then, something woke me up. It was a terrifying noise, like a horse in pain. I sat up, feeling my heart racing in my chest. I looked around, trying to find the source of the noise, but everything seemed normal. My cousins were still sleeping, and there was no sign of any disturbance. I thought it might have been a nightmare, so I tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I told my cousins about the noise, but they told me I was dreaming. They said that nothing had happened, and I must have imagined it. I started to doubt myself, thinking that maybe I had been dreaming after all. For years later, I found out the truth. I was visiting the same cabin with my family, and we met the owner of the property next to us. He told us that a donkey had been killed by a cougar on his property that same night. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the noise I had heard was not a dream, but the donkey's death cry. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the donkey's death, wondering if there was something I could have done to save it. I felt guilty for not investigating the noise further, for not trying to help the poor animal. But as the night went on, things started to get even more terrifying. I heard strange noises outside our cabin, like something was scratching at the windows. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be some small animals roaming around, but the noises persisted. Then, I heard footsteps outside our cabin, and they were getting closer. I woke up my family, telling them that something was outside, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just imagining things, like I did 4 years ago. But then, we heard a loud banging on the door. It was so loud that it made us all jump out of our skin. We tried to open the door, but it was stuck. We could hear something breathing heavily outside, like an animal, but it sounded much larger than a raccoon or a coyote. That's when we saw it. A giant donkey with eyes that glowed in the dark. It was covered in blood, and it looked angry. It started ramming into our cabin, trying to break in. We were all screaming, trying to get away from the door, but it wouldn't stop. The donkey's eyes seemed to be staring right at me, like it was blaming me for not helping it 4 years ago. I felt like I was going to die, like the donkey was seeking revenge for its untimely death. Finally, the banging stopped, and the donkey disappeared into the night. We were all shaken, but we didn't know what to do. We tried to leave the cabin, but our car wouldn't start. It was like we were trapped there, with no escape. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and confusion. We tried to stay awake, to protect ourselves from whatever was out there, but eventually, exhaustion overtook us. When we woke up in the morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and there was no sign of the donkey or any other strange occurrences. But I knew that what happened that night was real. I knew that the donkey's spirit was seeking revenge for its death, and I was just a pawn in its game. I never went back to that cabin again, and I never forgot about the donkey's revenge. It taught me that sometimes things are not what they seem, and that the past can come back to haunt you in unexpected ways. I still wonder what happened to that donkey's spirit, and if it's still out there seeking revenge on those who wronged it. Maybe it's best not to know, and to just let sleeping spirits lie. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the terrifying night, and the lesson it taught me about the power of revenge. I remember the camping trip vividly, even after all these years. It was supposed to be a fun family outing, a chance to bond and make memories. But everything changed on the second day when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, like a beast unleashed from its cage. The lightning was flashing before our eyes, illuminating the dark sky. The thunder was so loud it felt like the ground was shaking beneath our feet. I was only 10 years old at the time, and I was terrified. I crawled into my tent and hid, screaming my lungs out. But the storm was not the only thing that terrified me that night. It was the sound of the ambulance that chilled me to my core. It was the sound of a person in the campsite right beside us getting hit by lightning and being left unconscious. My parents rushed over to help, and I followed close behind, still shaking with fear. I saw the paramedics trying to revive the person, but they were too late. The lightning had taken a life that night. After that incident, everything changed. The once beautiful campsite became a place of dread and darkness. The sky was always gray, and the air was always thick with a sense of foreboding. The trees seemed to loom over us, casting shadows that stretched like claws. We tried to continue our trip, but the mood was somber. Even the laughter of my siblings felt hollow and forced. It was like we were all carrying the weight of that tragedy with us, and it was crushing us slowly but surely. The storm seemed to follow us, too. Every night, the lightning would flash and the thunder would rumble, reminding us of the tragedy that had occurred. I tried to tell myself that it was just a coincidence, that it was just a storm like any other. But deep down, I knew there was something else at play. One night, as I lay in my tent, I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized the whispers were too clear, too distinct. It was like a conversation was taking place right outside my tent. I peeked out, and I saw a figure standing in the distance. It was hard to make out any details, but it was definitely not human. It was like a shadow, a formless entity that seemed to be made of darkness. I tried to scream, but my throat felt tight. I felt like I was suffocating, like the darkness was closing in on me. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a nightmare, but when I opened them again, the figure was right in front of me. It didn't say anything, but I felt its presence like a weight on my chest. It was like it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I was trapped, at the mercy of this shadowy figure. I don't know how long I stayed like that, trapped and helpless. But eventually, the figure disappeared, and I was left alone in my tent, panting and trembling. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and I didn't want to be seen as crazy. The next morning, we packed up and left the campsite, but the memories stayed with me. The storm's curse had followed us, and I knew that it would never truly leave us. Every time I saw lightning or heard thunder, I would remember that camping trip and the darkness that had lurked within it. I never thought that sharing a tent with my friend at Boy Scout camp would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. My friend, let's call him Jake, had a history of sleepwalking. He had told me about it before we left for camp, but I didn't think much of it. I mean, what could go wrong, right? On the second night of camp, I was fast asleep when I felt something wet on my face. I jolted awake and realized that Jake was standing right next to me, peeing all over me. I screamed and pushed him away, but he just stood there and finished peeing on my sleeping bag. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I yelled at Jake to stop, but he didn't even wake up. He just went back to his sleeping bag and continued sleeping. The next morning, I woke up to find Jake acting completely normal, as if nothing had happened. I confronted him about it, but he denied everything. He told me that he didn't remember getting up in the middle of the night, let alone peeing on me. I was disgusted and angry. I couldn't believe that my friend had done this to me and didn't even have the decency to apologize or acknowledge what he had done. That day, I talked to our scoutmaster about the incident and asked if we could switch tents. He agreed, and we moved to a different tent with some other guys from our troop. For the next few nights, I slept peacefully without any incident. But on the last night of camp, something strange happened. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Jake standing next to me again. But this time, he was staring at me with dark, vacant eyes. I tried to wake him up, but he wouldn't budge. He just stood there, staring at me with an unsettling grin on his face. I was petrified. I didn't know what to do. I tried to shake him awake, but he wouldn't respond. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he walked out of the tent and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Jake acted as if nothing had happened. I asked him about the previous night, but he claimed that he didn't remember anything. As soon as camp was over, I went home and tried to forget about the whole ordeal. But the image of Jake standing over me with that creepy grin on his face haunted me for weeks. A few months later, I received a call from Jake's parents. They told me that Jake had been diagnosed with a severe sleep disorder that caused him to act out his dreams. They apologized for what had happened and said that Jake was getting treatment for his condition. I was relieved to hear that Jake was getting help, but the memory of that last night at camp still sends shivers down my spine. I never imagined that sleepwalking could be so terrifying, but that experience proved me wrong. I was a Girl Scout camp counselor, and it was my first summer at the camp. We were always warned about the dangers of the wilderness, but I never imagined that I would experience it firsthand. One night, while I was jungle peeing, I saw a moose standing just a few feet away from me. I panicked and started running as fast as I could, but in the darkness, I tripped and fell onto a porcupine. The pain was excruciating. I screamed and writhed in agony as quills pierced my skin. My mind was racing with fear and confusion. How could this happen to me? Was I going to die alone in the woods? As I lay there in the darkness, I suddenly became aware of a strange sensation. It was as if the woods were watching me, scrutinizing me, judging me. The trees rustled and creaked ominously, and I heard strange whispers and murmurs in the wind. I struggled to my feet and tried to run, but I was disoriented and stumbling. Every step I took was agony as the quills tore into my flesh. And all the while, the woods seemed to be closing in on me, trapping me in its embrace. Finally, I stumbled upon a small cabin. It was old and decrepit, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. But it was a refuge from the woods, and I stumbled inside, gasping for breath and crying out in pain. But the cabin was not empty. Inside, I found a strange old woman huddled in the corner, muttering to herself. She looked up at me with wild, unseeing eyes and cackled with glee. "You've come to join me," she screeched. "You've come to join me in the woods." I tried to back away, but she lunged at me, grabbing me with gnarled hands and pulling me closer. Her breath was hot and sour, and her grip was iron strong. "You'll never leave the woods," she whispered in my ear. "The woods will never let you go." And then, she started to change. Her skin grew gray and bark-like, her eyes turned into empty black pits, and her fingers turned into gnarled branches. She became a living tree, twisting and writhing in agony as she transformed. I screamed and fought, but she held me fast, her grip unbreakable. And then, I realized the truth. The woods had claimed me. The moose and the porcupine were just the beginning. The woods were alive, and they hungered for my soul. I woke up in my tent, my body aching and covered in sweat. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a stupid nightmare. But as I looked outside, I saw the woods looming in the darkness, and I knew that the nightmare was just beginning. The woods were watching, and they were waiting for me. I never thought a simple camping trip would turn into the scariest experience of my life. It all started a couple of years ago when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend in the great outdoors. We found a campsite that looked promising, but little did we know that we would be facing a problem that we had never encountered before: raccoons. The first night went smoothly, but the second night was when things started to get creepy. We heard rustling sounds outside our tents, and we assumed it was just some small animals roaming around. We decided to ignore it and went back to sleep. But the next morning, we found that our food supplies were scattered all over the place, and the trash cans were overturned. We realized that we had a raccoon problem, and we needed to be more careful. The campsite manager gave us specific instructions on how to handle the raccoons, and we followed them diligently. We were told not to leave any food or fragrant items outside our tents, and we were instructed to use scentless shampoo and soap while taking a shower. We thought that was the end of the raccoon problem, but we were wrong. One of my friends, Lisa, decided to use some strawberry-scented shampoo instead of the scentless stuff we were instructed to use. She didn't think it would be a big deal, but little did she know that it would lead to a horrifying experience. That night, Lisa woke up to a strange sensation on her head. She thought it was just her hair falling on her face, but then she felt something licking and chewing on her hair. She turned on her flashlight and saw a raccoon combing through her hair, licking and chewing on it. Lisa panicked and started screaming, which woke us all up. We immediately jumped out of our tents and saw the raccoon scurrying away. Lisa was shaking and crying, and we were all terrified. We realized that the raccoons were not just a nuisance, but they were becoming aggressive. The next day, we complained to the campsite manager, but he didn't seem too concerned. He just gave us some more instructions on how to handle the raccoons and told us to be more careful. We felt helpless and vulnerable, and we knew that something needed to be done. That night, we decided to set up a trap to catch the raccoons. We baited it with some food, and we waited for hours. But as the night grew darker, we started hearing strange noises. It sounded like the raccoons were circling our tents, and we could hear their growls and hisses. We were terrified, but we didn't want to show it. We stayed inside our tents, waiting for the morning to come. But when the sun rose, we realized that something had happened. Our traps were gone, and there were no signs of any raccoons in the area. We packed our things and left the campsite, relieved to be out of there. But the scariest part was yet to come. A few days after our camping trip, Lisa started experiencing strange symptoms. Her scalp was itchy, and she had a fever. She went to the doctor, and he found out that she had contracted a rare virus from the raccoon's saliva. The virus was so rare that there was no cure for it, and Lisa had to be hospitalized. That's when we realized that the raccoons weren't just a nuisance, but they were seeking revenge. They had somehow managed to outsmart us, and they had infected Lisa with a deadly virus. We never went camping again after that, and we warned everyone we knew to stay away from that campsite.